With that, I'd really like to open it up with your career in the intelligence sphere. If you could go into your background on that some more.
Sure. So, just for the record, I am Canadian. So, I spent
Right.
my entire career in the Canadian intelligence community. So, the first half, as you alluded to, was with an organization called Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, the same as NSA in the States. So, it's
Okay.
signals intelligence. We're the exact same organization, just we're Canadian, you're American. And then, I specialized in the Middle East. I was both an Arabic and a Farsi linguist. So, I understood Arabic and Persian. And then in 2001, actually just 10 months before 9/11, I moved over to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is kind of an FBI CIA hybrid. We're a security intelligence organization, not a foreign intelligence organization.
Okay.
And it's there where I kind of shifted my focus to looking at why Canadians thought that joining Al Qaeda was a good idea, or Al Shabaab, or later on in the 2010s, Islamic State, and to try to understand their ideologies, how they got there, how they were influenced, and then helped my colleagues who were investigators to actually investigate and eventually turn over information to the police, which in Canada at the federal level is the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And then they would take the ball and basically run a criminal investigation with a goal to pressing charges, either on terrorism or attempted murder or whatever kind of thing. So, yeah, so all in all, 32 years in security intelligence. And as you said, since my retirement in 2015, I've written 5 books on terrorism. I've authored thousands of blogs, tens of thousands of media interviews, and increasingly going into podcasts. So, it was a wonderful career that I had, and it's been a lot of fun over the past 5 years, where I've moved from having access to intelligence to commenting on intelligence, like we're doing today.
All right. Okay. Cool. So, you're so with when you were focusing on domestic affairs in Canada, and you were finding Canadians, joining Al Qaeda and ISIS eventually. What were the leading factors of them joining these extreme Islamic groups in your that you found throughout your research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, what I was able to do was to turn what we saw, I mean, obviously unclassified. I'm not authorized to disclose
Right, of course.
sources or methods. I'd be in jail now if that was the case. But I was able to sort of distill what we found into my very first book, published in 2015, the year I retired, called The Threat from Within, looking at why Westerners and Canadians thought that joining AQ was a good idea. And what we found a couple of things which were really interesting. One was that there was absolutely no profile. There was no age profile. There was no gender profile. There was no socioeconomic background profile. There was no mental, psychological profile. There was no education profile. Anybody from any walk of life could decide this was a good idea. What we did find, though, was that once these people were going down that trajectory to where they ended up becoming terrorists, is they exhibited some very, very similar signs. So they got very intolerant, for example, in their particular faith, which in this case was Islam, very rejectionist of any other interpretations. It's my way or the highway. Bernard Lewis said it really well after 9/11. I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell, which is eventually, this is their ideology, right?
Right. Okay.
And then of course, it was all about foreign policy. It was all about the fact that the West is evil. And then they get into some really bizarre, esoteric, religious topics like the apocalypse, the end of the world, the role of martyrdom, the obligatory nature of jihad. I mean, it's not an option; you have to do it. Right. And then just basically they became very rejectionist, intolerant people, and they thought that they were right and everyone else was wrong. And that led to the point where they joined terrorist groups that essentially demanded our that we give up, that we surrender, and if we don't, they're going to kill us. And that's exactly what they've been doing across the Middle East and across South Asia and many parts of Africa, and unfortunately in your country and my country on rare occasions, terrorist attacks here. So it really was a bit of a dog's breakfast, if you want to put it that way, in terms of who these people were. And I'm just pushing back against this notion that you can somehow profile this. You can't. They come from all over the map, all different backgrounds. But what was significant about the book that I wrote, I think, was that it pointed out to signs that are worrisome. But here's the other catch here. Just because you exhibit signs doesn't mean you're going to actually do anything. The vast majority of people, and this is still true today, the vast majority of people, like those ISIS wankers that go online and threaten death to America, death to Canada, death to whatever, never do anything. The vast majority of people are either cowards or incompetent. or just don't never move from thought to action or even words to action, which makes it a real challenge for your security intelligence and law enforcement agencies. So if if you're sitting on the internet monitoring all these channels, which ones do you follow and why? So we tried to figure out whether we could develop not a profile, but a way to distinguish the walkers from the talkers.
Right.
Those that talk the talk versus those that walk the walk. And we made a bit of progress in that regard, but still, it's really, really hard thing to do. So you end up investigating a lot of people that at the end of the day probably aren't going to do anything, but you always tell yourself, can I take that chance?
Right. So I assume like one thing you would look at is like, say they are starting to make these more hateful and radical opinions online. And then you start looking into, well, are these people traveling to certain places like maybe Pakistan, Afghanistan to get training and then come back as a homegrown terrorist? I'm sure that's something you all took part in, right?
Absolutely. And there was something really curious that we found as well. So obviously we're talking Islamist extremism here, not far right, not Antifa, not whatever kind of the Tamil Tigers, whatever. We found something really interesting was that people who, as you said, were preparing to leave, so leave Canada, leave the United States to go and join a terrorist group, they would do two really peculiar things. One is that they would ask forgiveness of all their family and friends. So they'd say, you know, that time I pissed you off, can you please accept my apology? And the second thing they did was they paid off all of their debts, all of their financial debts. Now, I don't know about you, but if I got a one-way ticket to martyrdom, MasterCard is the last thing I'm paying off. Like, right, try to collect me when I'm dead. Good luck with that, buddy.
Right.
But there's this notion amongst the jihadi ideologues that if you die with unsecured or unpaid financial debts, your martyrdom gets canceled out. So I imagine this scenario where you're blowing yourself to bits, and unfortunately, a lot of innocent people in the process, and you gain your martyrdom, right? You're on a one-way cloud to heaven kind of thing, and you get up there and you're ready to go to paradise, you know, what they call Jannah, with with all the benefits, the virgins, all that kind of bullshit that they talk about, and then they stop you at the gate and say, "Hey, Phil, you know, good job on the suicide operation. Unfortunately, MasterCard just called us." and you owe MasterCard $500. So sorry, buddy, it's all for naught. I can't accept you as a martyr. So I guess you're going the other way, which is a lot warmer than right here. And you're going to have your entrails eaten by some she-devil for the next 10,000 millennia kind of thing. So, but yeah, we did see people actually leaving money behind with notes saying, please pay off my debts before I go to Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, which is kind of weird to think about it.
Yeah, I'd never even heard of that before. Yeah. So there's this narrative online, and it gets brought up sometimes, but people will say that like Islamic extremists you tend to be like sad or like oppressed men essentially, and like they get angered and they turn to Islam. But like the counterpoint to that discussion I've always thought was, weren't a lot of the Saudis that committed 9/11, weren't they very well off, like lawyers and okay, that's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure.
No, you're absolutely right. And we found people with doctorates, people with master's degrees, people working in the oil patch, which, like in your country, my country, pays an awful lot of money. Mm-hmm. We saw, well-placed people. We had a doctor up here who was involved in a terrorist plot. We had engineers. We had one guy was an X-ray technician, and he's now serving a jail sentence for a plot here in Canada. And we had the losers too. We had the people that didn't have 2 cents to rub together, or couldn't organize a piss up in a bar, or whatever kind of thing. Were marginalized, whatever that's supposed to mean. But yeah, there's this myth that somehow these people were all they were poorly off. Society had wronged them. Life had wronged them. And they were seeking vengeance or revenge against something. And that simply wasn't the case. Again, as I said earlier, they come from all different walks of life. So yes, you're going to find the ones that never got past kindergarten and never had a job and never had a relationship or that kind of thing. But you equally saw the people who were extremely successful in life and decided to take this pathway. So again, going back to what I said, it's really hard to come up with any kind of a template for that, right? So you don't base it on who they are. You base it on what they say, what they write, and what they do. Because if you go for some kind of profile beforehand, you're gonna cast your net really, really wide, and you're gonna get a ton of false positives and a ton of false negatives. So a false positive saying, all people on welfare become jihadis. Well, no, the vast majority of people on welfare don't become jihadis. That's a false positive. A false negative says that you'll never find a person, living in Beverly Hills who joins Islamic State. Well, the first time you find one, that's a false negative. So you got to be really careful with this stuff. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting your time.
Right. So when in the best way that you can, because I know security clearances and everything, it's like, how would you guys go about finding people like these needles in the haystack that were going to go overseas to Al Qaeda and then eventually ISIS? Like, how would you go about that in a sense?
Right. So first and foremost, it's part of the mandate. So the organization that I work for has a piece of legislation called the CSIS Act, and it outlines quite specifically what we can and cannot do. And one of the priorities that's in the act is terrorism. Okay. So there's also espionage and foreign interference and sabotage and other stuff, but there's terrorism as part of what we can investigate. There's really four primary sources of information. One, there's human intelligence. Someone comes to you and says, hey, I had a conversation with somebody, or I know someone, or I met this guy online, and here's what he's saying. So that's a human source. And if that person agrees, you can run them as an actual source. You can actually pay them or whatever to go and find out more information. Get closer to this guy, find out what he really is kind of up to. The second thing would be what I used to do earlier, which is basically it's an intercept. So you're allowed to apply to a federal court, just like the FBI is, and get, I think you guys call them FISA warrants.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, the FISA courts.
Yeah, we call them Section 21 warrants for CSIS, or what's called Part 6 warrants for law enforcement in Canada. You can go to a judge and say, hey, James is a real problem, and here's what we know about him, and we think he's a dangerous person. We want to apply for the ability to intercept his email, his telephone calls, his WhatsApp, whatever, so we can find out just how much of a danger he poses. And the judge will say, yes, you've made your case, here's your warrant. The judge will say, no, it's not strong enough. You have to go back and find out more. That's the second one. The third one is obviously surveillance. If you're following this guy and he ends up, going out every single Saturday night with the same 10 other guys that you're worried about, that's an indication that he might be part of a cell, or he's a hanger-on, or he's a fellow traveler, whatever. And then the fourth thing is intelligence you receive from other partners, be it domestic or foreign. So in Canada, we're part of, you probably heard of the infamous Five Eyes relationship, which is, so the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. It's a post-World War II intelligence agreement, and there's nothing like it in the world. No five countries share more intelligence than our five countries. Part of it's historical. We're all Anglophone countries. Mm-hmm. We all fought the wars together, all that kind of stuff. We have a similar outlook in life. Mm-hmm. Maybe not so much now in your country, but that's a whole other whole other issue.
Yeah.
But it's an amazing intelligence sharing, and very sensitive intelligence is shared amongst those five partners. So often we'll get a tip from a partner saying, hey, we're following this guy, and guess what? And I'll give you a very concrete case. This goes back to about 2004. I'll never forget it. It was a Friday afternoon. We got a call from our UK friend saying, we're following these bunch of jihadis, and we know they're up to something. And when we were following them, we followed them to maybe the old internet cafes you used to go to when you didn't have access at home,
right?
Before Wi-Fi. And so we found these guys in a cafe, and one guy shows up. We didn't know who he was, and he's showing them these designs for building like a detonator. Oh. And this guy, we found out he's Canadian. He's got off the plane this morning. And so they gave us the information. That was a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, we were up on all powers, possible to try and follow this guy. But if the Brits hadn't told us about him, we probably wouldn't have known about him by ourselves, because he hadn't crossed our radar yet. He hadn't crossed those tripwires. But because the British are sharing intelligence with us, they can tell us, we found this guy. He's in your backyard. You might want to see who he is, and at the same time help us in our investigation, so we can figure out what's his role. Is he important? Is he helping our guys to start blowing shit up here in the UK? So that's another example of good intelligence sharing amongst allies, and it really is a very great advantage. And we here in Canada, we're a small player relatively speaking. Like when I worked at CSC and Signals Intelligence, we had about 1/100th of the manpower NSA did. We're really small. I think we're good. We're a punch above our weight, but still, we rely a lot on our sharing relationships, and it definitely gave us a lot of advantages over the time that I spent there, the 32 years that I spent in that business.
Okay, so I know you mostly focused on domestic extremists, but from what you've read and studied, do you find that the same reasons why these domestic cells get started is very similar to how these cells start in, let's say, like Pakistan or Iraq or Syria?
I think so. The only thing I would throw in there as a possible difference is that, if you compare the average Pakistani, socioeconomic status, or the average, income for an Afghan family, for example. There's they don't have nowhere near the GDP per person that you guys have in the United States or we have in Canada.
Right.
So there's a lot larger share of impoverished people, right? Uneducated people who don't have good jobs. So in a sense, you probably have more people from that kind of background that would join, but I would argue that most of the country comes from that kind of background. So again, you're stuck with the same problem, right? If you say that poverty is a major driver for radicalization and terrorist group joining in Pakistan, well, 95% of Pakistan is in the same boat. And yet 95% of Pakistanis don't join Al-Qaeda or MQM or the Kashmiri terrorist groups or whatever. So I think there still are some similarities, but again, you'd have to go country by country to figure this thing out. What I would say to you, though, if you went all across the Western countries, you'd see fairly similar experiences with an interesting maybe difference in places like France and Belgium, which have a long history of Muslim communities that are underdeveloped. There's been a lot of racism, anti-Muslim racism in those countries. And so maybe they would be a little more of the underclass, let's say the United States and Canada. But again, I think it's fairly similar. But yeah, once you get to Afghanistan or Somalia or Nigeria, you're talking a whole different kettle of fish there because they have different realities than we do in the West.
For sure. So as someone that's interested in foreign affairs and national security, I've always kind of wondered, like, how does someone go about breaking into the intelligence industry? Like, what should someone aspiring to go into that field of work, what should they be working toward?
That's a great question. I get asked a lot. One of the things I really enjoy doing in my so-called retirement is talking to people who are interested in a career in intelligence. And actually, I just put out a podcast about a week and a half ago on my website, giving people hints on what they should do to position themselves best to get that opportunity. There's obviously a caveat here in that I don't know what the application rate is like for the FBI or the CIA or NSA. But I know for my organization, and this data dates back years ago because I haven't worked there in 7 years. We were getting at least 15,000 applications a year for about 40 positions. So do the math, right? A lot of people are making it through. As I said on my podcast, to me, the best candidate is somebody who's curious, somebody who reads a lot. Having a specialty is not a bad idea. So if you specialize in China, for example, you might be a really popular person and you speak Chinese. There's a place that, obviously both our countries have huge concerns about what the PRC is doing.
Right.
If you're a Russia specialist, you are now again somebody in demand because you weren't in demand after the wall fell. I can tell you categorically that I was there when the wall fell, and we had a lot of really good Russian linguists who were monitoring Soviet military communications, and we won, right? The war was over. We don't need you anymore. Like, thank you for your service to Queen and country, or in your case, whatever, Queen. But we simply don't need your talents anymore. And then look what's happened, 30 years later, right? With Putin in power and Russian foreign interference and that kind of thing. The other thing I advise people is that, that don't just be curious, but be critical. Accept that there's things that you don't know, but you're going to find out. Look at different sides of an argument. Don't always take the same thing. So, if you watch Fox News, then watch NBC. If you watch NBC, watch Fox News. Get a different take on things. Don't be so dogmatic in your thinking. And the other thing that I tell people is that most of these jobs require a good writing skill. So write every day, and write and do analysis, and have people look at it, kind of thing. Start a blog, for example, to see what your writing skills are like. And perhaps most importantly in intelligence, nobody reads 100-page intelligence reports. If they're over a page and a half, 2 pages, they're too long.
Oh, that's perfect for me.
So if you have to take copious amounts of information and distill it down to very, very short. And it's not because the customers are stupid. It's because the customers are very busy.
Right. And if you're advising political figures, they got a lot on their plate already. You got to get that
exactly.
Yeah.
So, writing a PhD thesis on Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda, you're not going to get it read because, as you said, these people are very busy. They want to know, like, tell me what matters and tell me what matters now. Don't give me the history. I don't care what happened in 1864. Maybe you do, but if it's not relevant to what's happening today in a very obvious sense, then don't give me all the background. That's for maybe your other analyst colleagues or whatever kind of thing. Yeah,
right.
The prime minister wants to know, or the president wants to know now. Do we need to call in an airstrike? Is an attack imminent? What else can we do? Kind of thing. So keep it short, keep it concise, and the old line is bottom line up front, right? They call it bluff. So you put your absolute most important point in your very first sentence. You know,
Okay.
we have solid intelligence that Al Qaeda is planning an attack on New York tomorrow. That's what you want to tell the president or the governor or the mayor of New York or whatever kind of thing. So those
Okay.
are kinds of things that I tell people about. And because your background's irrelevant. I mean, I'm a linguist by profession. I worked as a multilingual analyst for 17 and a half years. And I happened to pick up Arabic and Farsi, but I wasn't a Middle East specialist when I joined. I learned I read, and I still read I still read hours and hours every day to learn that kind of stuff. So you have to go back to the curiosity thing. Pick an area of the world that just fascinates you,
Mm-hmm.
and learn everything about it.
Okay. I really appreciate that advice. Not just for myself, but maybe anyone that ever comes across this, and I did put links to your website, Twitter, and your
Oh,
YouTube
great.
channel. So
Thanks.
hopefully, if someone really enjoys this discussion, they can easily get a hold of
Cool.
your information. Uh,
Cool.
I wanted to transition to the broad subject of the war on terrorism.
Hmm?
There's kind of a narrative, at least here in the United States, that the war on terrorism has been a failure. Right now, Trump is moving more and more troops out of Afghanistan. Earlier this year, Trump started moving troops that we had on the border of northern Syria, and we're moving troops out of Iraq now. It
Mm-hmm.
seems that America has lost its will to engage in the Middle East, in a sense, at least with Americans boots on the ground. Um, I know, like I've said, you focus mostly on domestic issues, but like in your opinion, like do you see the war on terrorism as a failure, or what would your opinion be on that?
It's mixed. So actually, the fourth book that I wrote back in 20, hang on, now what year are we? In 2018, was called An End to the War on Terrorism. And I wrote that book very, very deliberately because I've always been against the use of the term war on terrorism, and for very simple reasons. And this is a line that I came across just shortly after 9/11 by an American who was working in Paris. And he said, every time you declare a war against a common noun, it rarely ends well. Think
Right.
of the war on drugs. How's that one going?
Not too well.
Not too well. Think of the war on poverty. Think of the war on, fill in the blank with a common noun, right? And he says for the very simple reason that common nouns can't surrender. You can't, poverty is not going to give up. Drugs are not going to say we're not going to do it anymore. So he says, whereas if you declare war against a proper noun, like, Germany, as we did in World War II, Germany can surrender, and then the war is over. So declaring a war against a common noun is a bad idea. The other thing I think what has made it hard for us is that we have, by using the term war on terrorism, we have overemphasized the military aspect of it versus the security, intelligence, law enforcement, and I would say civil society. Not to say there is no role for the military. My country's army joined you in Afghanistan a month after 9/11. Some, I think 150 Canadian soldiers died in Afghanistan in the time that we were there. And we pulled out in 2014. So it's not that the military has no role to play, but when you see it primarily as a military problem, you create an added dimension. And that is you end up being on someone's soil who doesn't normally want you there.
Right.
Right. So as I've said to people, after 9/11, there really was no choice. If President Bush had decided not to go into Afghanistan after the death of 3,000 people at the hands of a guy hiding in a cave in Afghanistan, he would have been crucified. So right. I think he played the hand that was dealt to him. 2003 Iraq's a different story. That was a massive mistake based on intelligence that simply wasn't there or was misinterpreted, which is my preferred way of looking at it. So you end up in a country and you quickly piss off the locals. Why? Well, sometimes you end up killing civilians through drone strikes that don't work so well. Or, you're in a Humvee and you feel threatened and you open up fire and you kill a couple of kids kind of thing or whatever. So the locals turn against you really quickly. And it's been shown historically that many terrorist groups have actually arisen out of foreign interventions. And I'll just use one example for the sake of brevity. Back in 2005, Ethiopia invaded Somalia, probably at the behest of the American government at the time. And as a consequence, Al-Shabaab started up. There was no Al-Shabaab before Ethiopia invaded. Now Al-Shabaab has been the premier terrorist group in Somalia for the past 15 years. And they have killed tens of thousands of Somalis and show no signs of weakening anytime soon. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with what Al-Shabaab does, but I understand why they were created, and that's because they saw Ethiopians as a foreign invasion force that they wanted to help to get rid of them. Okay, so that's why I think this war on terror thing has been misconstrued. But there's no question that you asked me, has it been a failure? No, it hasn't been a failure, because we've had successes. Bin Laden's dead. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. The French just got Drukdal, an AQIM guy in northern Africa a week and a half ago. So yeah, we've taken out some pretty nasty characters, and that's through drone strikes, airstrikes, special ops, like the one that got Bin Laden in May of 2011 in Pakistan.
Right.
So it's not that the military has been, has had a lack of success. It's that it's not the best tool for this going forward. So we've been at this it's 19 years old. We've been at this, right? The war on terror, which was launched in basically September of 2001. And it's showing no signs of ending. There's still troop deployments. The French are still in the Sahel in North Africa. You guys are still in Afghanistan. You guys are still in Iraq. We were in Iraq until fairly recently as well. So, where does this whole thing kind of end? So and I'm biased. I worked for security intelligence. I did not work for the military. So it definitely is a security intelligence priority. I would argue it's also one of many priorities for law enforcement. And it's also the whole civil society thing that we can talk about, that they need to play, sort of step up their game as well. So it's multiple partners doing this. But I think when we label it a war, we tend to see it primarily through the lens of a military response. And we've seen that's not going to work. And I can't see how it's going to work anytime soon. If it hasn't worked for 20 years, it's not going to work in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I'm conflicted on it personally. I'm usually pro U.S. intervention in a sense. I kind of take. I'm a big fan of Christopher Hitchens, and I liked his arguments mostly for the reasons to go into Iraq. Like in the past, we had funded Saddam Hussein, and he committed mass atrocities against the people of Iraq as well as the people in Iran with the civil war. He used chemical weapons against them, and he used chemical weapons and massacred the Kurds as well in the north. So I think in a sense, America had a responsibility to take care of Saddam, but I won't lie. The Bush administration did make a mess of it. Not just going in, but the occupation of Iraq was a huge mess. My only thing is, so when Obama came in, was largely elected on the failures of the Iraq War in a sense, as well as many other things, but largely on the failures of the Iraq War, we began to withdraw from Iraq, and Iran moved in because Iran has huge influence within the Shia majority in Iraq. And then you had the continued Sunni Shia wars against each other, and we saw the birth of ISIS. So it's, in a way, it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
I'm glad you used that phrase, and you're exactly right, is that once you go in, you can't get out, and yet you have to get out. So, as much as I'm not a fan of the current U.S. president, his decision to take U.S. forces out of Afghanistan was, in a sense, the right one, because you've been there far too long. Afghanistan is not a shining beacon of democracy.
No,
and it will not be anytime soon. The fact that he thinks the Taliban are a peace partner is a joke.
Right.
The Taliban is stated categorically they will not negotiate with the current Afghan government, and they will not accept anything less than the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, essentially the Afghan version of the caliphate that ISIS established in 2014. So being there was problematic, but getting out is problematic, because we know for a fact that when you guys leave, that the power vacuum that's created, the Taliban's going to fill it. The Afghan army, God love them, brave men and that are doing this, do not have the power to maintain control over the country. So the Taliban are going to win. If the Taliban wins, that means Al Qaeda wins. So at what point do you see the possible preparations for another major attack internationally, in which people sitting in Afghanistan who have free reign, they can do whatever they want because nothing one's going to stop them, and then something else happens and we say, well, let's go back to Afghanistan and find the guys that carried out this attack. So you end up in this sort of, I don't know, this never ending. It's almost like a Groundhog Day, right? Where it just keeps happening again and again. So the bottom line is that there is no good solution. And anyone who tells you that, oh, just do this or just do that, really doesn't understand the situation. So as you said, we're damned if we do and we're damned if you don't. I don't have any answers for this. I mean, God, if I could solve this thing, you couldn't afford me on your podcast. I would be living in that. I'd be living in that mansion in Vancouver, which costs $10 million, kind of thing. It really is a tough thing, and I hate when people try to oversimplify it. It's really, really complicated.
Right, and like just recently, it's been a few months. Actually, it's almost been a year, I think, when Trump moved our troops from the border in Syria, abandoning our allies, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely made up of
Kurds,
of the Kurds, to our NATO ally Turkey. So, of course, I mean,
NATO ally Turkey.
Yes. Well, I mean, you could go back to Cyprus and even before then, how much of an ally Turkey's been. But I feel like the world, in a sense, if America withdraws back to its borders as it did before World War II, the world is far more chaotic.
Yeah.
And I don't see a world in which the isolationist policy tendency leads to anything better. Now, I'm not an imperialist in a sense where I just want to go into these countries, overthrow these dictators, and put in our own dictators. But I do see a need for, in a sense, nation building to build up these societies and these people out of being impoverished, but also to a point where they can have, well, it would take a long time, secular liberal societies. When World War II ended, we stayed in Japan and Germany for decades. And until recently, we still have troops in Germany. We're pulling them out now too. But I just don't see a world where America and our Western allies disengage, the world is any safer.
I agree with you. Obviously mistakes have been made, but the world needs an active, engaged America, which it has not had, I think, for the past almost 4 years. I do think that America is seen as a leader on many fronts, and that's generally a good thing. Again, I think there's some things that have been done that I would not support, but you're right. We do create vacuums, and the problem with nation building is it's a very heroic, romantic kind of notion. But,
fair enough.
But as you said, how long do you have to stay? We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. Have we made progress? Absolutely. The place is not. Well, maybe. Okay. I'm gonna be generous here. The place is not as bad today as it was 20 years ago, but it's nowhere near a functioning liberal democracy.
For sure.
It is 2 steps away from going back to what it was before. So does that mean that because you can never achieve perfection, you don't do it? I don't think that's the case. I think that, you guys, NATO, the Western Alliance, the types of international organizations that have a lot of credence, a lot of credibility, are also part of that. The UN has a role to play in that. As much as people despise the UN, it does have some really positive effects, at times. It is a collective effort. And I think that, they always say that building fences never works. We tried that. We tried that in the 30s, right? We tried all kinds of protectionism in terms of our economies. And what did that get us?
Right.
That got us the Depression of the 1930s. And, we've lived in this post-World War II economic boom. And you're right. The United States and its allies stayed in Germany. There was the Marshall Plan, this brilliant plan by the U.S. I guess he was the state Secretary of State. Say, let's just pour money into Europe, help them build so that they don't revert back to the fascist dictatorship that got us here in the first place. Because we learned our lesson from World War I, right? When Germany just surrendered in 1918, the Treaty of Paris basically made the Treaty of Versailles, said to Germany, you owe us a gazillion bazillion marks for what you did, which impoverished the German nation, and then led it into a depression in the 1920s, and then eventually led to the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist Party, because we basically punished them. And were they responsible? Absolutely. They started the war, we didn't. But we learned our lesson and said, okay, we can blame Germany for World War II, because yes, they did invade Poland, my grandfather's homeland, in 1939. But if we follow that same path we did in 1919, we're going to find ourselves in the exact same situation in 1959. We want to do that? Probably not. So if we support the creation of a democracy, and of course then we got West Germany, right, which was a model democracy and still is a model democracy. And of course they had East Germany, because of the separation of the two countries. But now Germany is the power in Europe and has been for decades, largely because we stuck with them after the Second World War. So we're retrenching, coming back and closing our borders, building up fences, and having nothing to do, say, you guys are on your own, good luck. rarely ends well. And of course, there are other actors that want to play in that game.
Exactly.
Look what China's doing with their Belt and Road Initiative. They're building infrastructure all over the world because countries can't get financing from Western banks or because Western countries don't care. Chinese said, we'll do it. We got a bazillion workers that are looking for something to do. We'll build your dams and your highways and your airports and your coal plants and your oil facilities, and we'll give you great terms. Oh, but there's a problem. If you can't pay us back after 20 years, guess what? We own the facility. And there's been many cases of that that's actually happened. So it looks like a great deal on paper when these countries sign up. They realize they can't pay back. China starts calling in its debts. Well, I guess we own your coal plant. Thank you very much.
The Chinese offer loans with far less strings attached than we do, and the World Bank does. So that's, and these impoverished nations really need the funding. They need to rebuild. They need to build their infrastructure up if they're ever going to become a more modern nation. So.
Is that, do we want the Chinas to fill the space that we have been filling for the past 75 years since the end of the Second World War?
Right.
They're not our ally.
No, not at all. And even now we're seeing flare-ups on the Indian and Chinese border, and supposedly a couple hours ago troops were killed on
a bunch of Indian troops.
Yeah. So. And another flare-up we're seeing is North Korea seems to be rattling their saber again. So it's just, I jokingly said on Twitter, how can 2020 get any worse? And then I tweeted something about North Korea doing this, and I'm like, well, I was stupid to say that.
Well, I'll share a story with you. So about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I was commenting that it's all COVID all the time. Like, can I please read a news story that's not COVID related? I'm not just, COVID's very serious. I'm not one of these people that believes it is. It's very, very serious. But I was getting tired of reading COVID story. So I said, great, maybe the news today will be different. And the news was the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which has led to the situation we're in right now with the Black Lives Matter protests, the defunding the police protests. So maybe I should stop wishing for the news to change, because it doesn't change it in a good direction.
It doesn't get any better. So on my channel, I've mostly focused on the Syrian civil war. Mm-hmm. At the time, so I was born in 1991. I was lucky. I never knew the horrors of the Cold War. I've lived a very peaceful life. I was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened. I didn't understand what was going on. I kept thinking people were saying tourists, because I never heard the term terrorists.
Tourists flew planes in the buildings.
Right. I couldn't comprehend it, but I still have the images of what was going on the news burned into my brain. And so I wasn't really political until my my senior year of high school. I was more conservative and religious at the time, but as I got older, I started moving more center leftish. But in a sense, I was still very isolationist. It wasn't until I saw the horrors of ISIS online. I have a very morbid curiosity in a sense, and I saw the many killings and beheadings essentially of ISIS. So it really changed. It forced my views to change, because in a way I never had to bear witness to that kind of horror. And I feel like sometimes humans have to see how evil and how bad things can be before they can change their mind on, no, we actually need to do something about this. I remember when Kobani was being besieged by ISIS and the Turks closed the border to stop Kurds from Turkey going in to help. Before then, the border had been completely open, so ISIS militants could hop the border essentially. But that was a real big turnaround for me. And at the time, I was starting to study Middle East politics in college. So, and then we had the whole Arab Spring. Where I'm going with this is, do you think and my generation or the younger generations, do they actually realize what is going on, because if to me it feels like my generation just does not care at all what's going on around the world, especially in the Middle East.
You've raised so many good points there. It's hard to know where to start.
Right.
I found your comment about where you were at 9/11 interesting, because I actually had my eldest daughter, who's 2 years older than you. I had her on a podcast, and I said, "What do you remember of 9/11?" So she would have been just turned 12 when 9/11 happened, and she knew, she didn't know I worked for the security service, but she knew that something was wrong because her teachers were all crying, and she knew something was wrong when I came home and I said, "Okay, I'm not going to be home for a little while. So, like, don't worry about me. I'm not going, anywhere, but I have to stay at work for a long time because this is what we're trying to do, trying to figure out what had happened." I do think that your generation is actually, you have advantages and disadvantages, and they're the same thing. What you're subjected to right now is far more information than you can process.
Right.
Okay. So when I started my career in security intelligence in the 1980s, so well before you were even a glint in your mother and father's eye, we were already drowning in information that we had collected, signals that we had intercepted. I can't imagine what my counterparts who work in those agencies now are dealing with in terms of data flow. We used to call it drinking from a fire hose. It is now drinking from, I don't know, the Hoover Dam. Like there's just so much information out there. And the problems that people like yourself are faced with is, what do I read and why? And what do I believe and why? And you're seeing this right now with COVID, right? Just to use a small example, the conspiracy theories. Oh, it's Bill Gates who planned this because he wants to sell a chip to put in your brain, right? Or it's a Chinese bioweapon, or it's, I don't know, George Soros or something. So I think in a lot of cases, people just get fed up because there's far too much information to process. And so you get frustrated. So what you do either is you turn off, you don't care. Like you said, I couldn't find Middle East on the map. I don't care. It's not my problem. Or you pick one source and one source only, which is rarely a good thing, because what we used to do in intelligence, which was critical to our mission success, is you find out a piece of information, you have no idea if it's true or false. Go back to the Iraq War. Remember the source curveball that talked about the weapons of mass destruction? Yeah, well, right. He was lying. He lied as a source. And so what you do in intelligence is you corroborate the information from multiple sources. So the more people say it, they're either all lying simultaneously, or there's some truth to the matter. Then you corroborate it from different types of modes. You get a human source, you get an intercepted signal, you get an allied information, and you piece this puzzle together, try to figure out, is what I'm seeing accurate or is it not accurate? Because decisions are made based on what your advice is. So I think that when you sort of default to one source and one source only, you're going to get, everyone has a bias, right? And right. I'm not trying to say don't watch Fox News or don't watch MSNBC or don't watch, the Onion News Network. I'm saying that you have to diversify your sources so that you see the biases, you get different perspectives on things, you just get different angles on things, so that you can be in a position to make the best decision possible based on all the information you have, and not get sort of caught up in the fact that there's so much out there. So I spend 3 to 4 hours a day reading on average. I scan about 200 news sites internationally because I look at what's happening in the world of terrorism. So I'm very narrowly focused on terrorism, but I'm still looking at 200 different sources every day because some sources are bullshit,
right?
And some sources are really good. But that's a discipline. I get up at 6 a.m. and I read for, like I say, 2, 3, 4 hours every morning to get caught up on things. So I might want to podcast or blog something or whatever, or tweet something. I'm not saying everyone should read 3, 4 hours a day, but if you really want to be up on what's happening in the world, pick 4 or 5 good sources. So I would say in your country, New York Times is probably a good source. The BBC in London is a really, really good source. Al Jazeera is actually not a bad source for the Middle East. So I would look at a number of sources, look at the same information and see who's saying what, why they're saying it, what is their background. And the one thing I'd also caution people really carefully today, everybody's an expert, which means nobody's an expert. You know what I mean? The term expert gets used by all kinds of people that really, and when you look into their backgrounds, you ask yourself, so why is this person an expert in this? What have they done? So a person commenting on police practices who never worked as a police officer, and you're an expert on the police? What makes you that expert? So I personally never use the term expert to refer to myself. I give my background. I worked in intelligence for 3 decades. I've written 5 books, but I never, ever call myself an expert because the term has become so It's sort of
nebulous.
it's really thinned out, and I don't want to be associated with people that I feel, in all honesty, and I'm not engaging in personal attacks here. I just don't think you're the expert that you think that you are. So I choose myself to not to use that term.
It's usually either that, or people completely disregard what experts say because they're either paid off or they have some kind of conspiracy about what they're involved in.
Yeah, so I think it really is hard today to figure out what's real and what's not. But I think with a little effort, you can do a better job of that. And it might take only half an hour a day to sort of read what's happening from a. And if you want to throw Fox News as one of your sources, go right ahead. Just make sure it's not your only source, because like every other source, it's biased.
Yeah, I kind of have a personal story with that. So when I was in college, my early years, I started moving more towards the libertarian movement, and eventually it started going into the I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's called the anarcho-capitalism.
Yep.
Okay. So at the time, I was going down that rabbit hole, but I was also watching people like Alex Jones and reading articles from Russia Today because they were very critical of the United States. So thankfully, I had very good friends that would challenge me on my what I was saying. I also had really great professors. They never called me out for what I was saying. They always just challenged it, and well, why don't you look at this as well? So I mean, I chalk it up to being young and dumb, but in a sense, you do have to learn how to process information and where those sources are coming from.
Exactly. And I like what you said. You had friends that challenge you. There's nothing like having a good civil debate. We can agree to disagree. Let's not have a debate. You call me an asshole because you don't like what I said, and then we part angry. Just say, okay, I see your point. I don't agree with it. Here's my point. Look at things from different angles. And the more we do that, the better educated we are, the better we appreciate that there are different views on things. On every, again, a simple example, Antifa, which has been a lot of the news in your country lately. The president wants to list them as a terrorist organization. That apparently is probably constitutionally impossible, but that's a whole other issue. Right. But Antifa is a complicated thing. It does have certain members that I would say engage in acts of terrorism based on my definition of terrorism, but there are other aspects of it that are not terrorist in nature. But so you have to get those different angles on things. And the same thing now with the whole defund the police movement, right? There's good points on both sides. So let's have a debate about that without calling each other names and without getting angry and without burning down some shop in downtown Philadelphia because we feel like doing it to make our point.
Right. It seems like tension. Well, since the Civil War in my country, it seems like tensions are at a boiling point, and it's been going on since before I was born. But it feels like Trump has exacerbated this.
I think so. Yeah.
So as I was saying, when I was younger, I was involved with the more right leaning. My senior year, I was involved with the Tea Party Patriots here in the States. So it's just kind of interesting because I see a perspective of where I could easily see someone like Trump coming to power, because there has been this boiling of right-wing populism in a sense. It kind of started off with the Tea Party Patriots, and they mostly focused about taxes, but you also had this underbelly of it that was accusing Obama of not even being an American citizen. So there's these racist aspects to it. And then if you went further down the whole in the libertarian sphere, like I did, there was kind of this idea of this one world organization, and then if you wanted to go one route, the alt-right route, it would be the Jewish world organization. So there's just a lot of bad misinformation, a lot of conspiracies that have just flourished online, and then you see on Twitter these days there's a lot of misinformation coming out as well from the far left. Any action overseas, when Bolivia got rid of their what was his name? I can't remember.
Evo Morales.
Exactly. Basically, people were already claiming it was a CIA coup. Iran protests start happening. CIA coup. People think the CIA they're either omniscient and they're everywhere and they're behind everything, or they think they're they can't do anything. There's no in between. And it's kind of weird. But
I actually have friends who work for the CIA because they were one of our allies at the time, and there's no question the CIA has undertaken, shall we say, some questionable activities in the past that did lead to state overthrow. But you're right, there's not a CIA cabal running the world. I want to weigh on something interesting just to show you how complicated things are. You talked about the Tea Party, so obviously the tax result in the 1770s in your country, which led to the War of Independence and the creation of the United States as an independent country. If you were the British colonials in Boston in 1776, you'd see the Tea Party as terrorists.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right? It all depends on perspective, right? As we've been saying. Now, the Tea Parties for you guys are incredible heroes. They stood up against British tyranny, against, taxation without representation, et cetera, et cetera. But from the other side, they would say, actually, you guys are engaged in terrorism. I mean, we didn't have terrorism in the 1770s. There was no definition of it back then. But again, it all goes back to the perspective, right? Your view is your view, and it may not jive with my view. So it's, and Ronald Reagan famously said, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, which just made things more complicated. I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s when the Contras were quite active in the eastern part of the country. And I can tell you that most Nicaraguans did not see these guys as freedom fighters. They saw them as terrorists because they were killing civilians at the time. So it is all about perspective and point of view. And I'm just saying that as decent people, we have an obligation to at least acknowledge that someone else has a different view on things. We don't have to agree with it, but was it Thomas Paine said, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's what we need more of these days, not this shouting and yelling and Molotov cocktails and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, in a sense, the world's far more complicated than people want to make it.
Yeah.
I think that boils down to a lot of what's going on. If I could direct our conversation back towards the Middle East, you had brought up that you had written about the ISIS prisoners being held by the SDF, and you wanted to talk about that, so I'll kind of open it up to you what you wanted to.
Sure. So your timing is impeccable, because I just read a news story literally an hour and a half ago where apparently, so my country, Canada, has really sat on the fence when it comes to repatriation of Canadians who fought for Islamic State. We have said, you know what, sucks to be you. You join ISIS, that's your problem, not mine. There are people in my country who are demanding that we repatriate them now at taxpayers' expense. My position has been somewhat in the middle. I think the children should be brought back now because the children did not choose to join ISIS. They were brought there by their parents. And I go one further. The children should be removed from their parents and placed with their extended family or in state care. Because any parent that brought their children to join an Islamic State is, in my definition, an unfit parent. And I think in both our countries, kids are removed from their parents. Why? Because they are being sexually abused, emotionally abused, physically abused, whatever. This is no different with Islamic State. So my country, your country, a lot of countries have been saying, you know what, we're not going to move heaven and earth to get you guys back. It sucks to be you, kind of thing. And well, if you stand trial in Iraq or Syria, your trial lasts 5 minutes. There's no defense. You're found guilty and then you're executed the day after, kind of thing, which is not what we tend to do in our country. So I've been advocating for the children to be taken back. But when it comes to the adults, my position is very simple. The crimes that they committed were crimes committed in Iraq and Syria. The Syrian government, no matter what we think of it, the Iraqi government, no matter what we think of it, has a sovereign right to try those people for crimes committed in their territory. In the same way, if I cross the border tomorrow, so I used to go to Detroit a lot as a kid to watch the Tigers play, okay? I'm from Southwestern Ontario. If I go to Detroit tomorrow and kill someone, does your country have the right to arrest me, try me, and incarcerate me for that murder?
Of course.
Absolutely. Now, we may agree to extradite me to a Canadian prison later on down the road, but you have a right to do that. And if your law is, calls for capital punishment, which your country does, my country does not, we have a problem because I committed a capital offense on your soil and your country has the right to serve that sentence. So I think that with the adults, that really they deserve to be tried where they are being held. Now, and then if we want to bring them back afterwards, maybe we can strike an extradition treaty. Although I'm pretty sure we don't have such treaty with either the Iraqis or the Syrians. I'd be doubtful your country has one either.
Right.
But there's people that want to bring them back, and my response is, well, bring them back to what? Are we going to charge them? Because how do you gather evidence? Because both our countries have a very high state of preparedness for evidence, right? You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone did X, Y, or Z. If you can't do that, you get acquitted. So where's the evidence these people join ISIS? Not intelligence, evidence, because the two are very, very different terms. these people may walk if they come back. What if they come back and radicalize others?
Right.
What if they come back and actually carry out a terrorist attack, which has happened, by the way, in parts of Western Europe. Returning foreign fighters have done this. Not a lot of them, very, very few, but still. And then there's the problem of, so if they come back, do you monitor them? Do you investigate them? Do you follow them? Where's the resources going to come from that? I mean, while they're sitting in a camp in Iraq, you don't have to worry about them because they're not part of your problem. If they send back, then you need to have your surveillance. You need to have your intelligence officers. You need to have your human sources. You need to have your federal court warrants to intercept their emails. That poses a burden on your protectors, on your spies and your cops to do this kind of thing. So this is why I've been pretty adamant since day one that we should not move heaven and earth to bring these people back. The children, yes, but not the parents. They should stand trial where their crimes were committed.
I know the Syrian Democratic Forces have struggled also with containing all these people, and the violence in these camps are insane. Yeah. If and it's not just from the men; it's from the women as well.
Yeah.
You'll see women attack other women for removing their veil.
Yeah.
These people are true believers, and there's no deprogramming them in a sense. Like these people are willing to kill themselves and others for their beliefs, and I do think that these people need to face essentially like the I believe it was called the Nuremberg trials in a sense. Mm-hmm. These people do need to face the what they did, what they contributed to, and the horrors, especially against the people, the Yazidi people.
The Yazidis, exactly. There actually were efforts in the last few years where I don't know if it was the was it the International Court of Justice? It was some international body that said we will help the Kurds set up proper courts to try these people. I supported that 1,000%.
Yeah.
If we can provide them with judges and lawyers and clerks and whatever it takes to make this thing work, let's do it. Do it in a heartbeat. That way, at least we have a fair trial versus a 5-minute trial. And these people have their day in court. They can, summon their defense kind of thing. But the fact remains they did join Islamic State, so there has to be some penalty for that. That would be a lot better solution than to try to bring them back here. And I can tell you categorically, I don't know about your country, we're going to have one hell of a time laying terrorism charges or any charges and gain a successful prosecution because we're not going to have the evidence.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that. I often see like in the news, well, not often, but when it is brought up, you'll have some young woman saying that she didn't know what she was getting involved in.
Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Wail. Cry. I thought I was going out for a night on the town, and next thing I end up in Raqqa. Seriously, sister, you're going to sell us that line?
Yeah.
Try another one.
Yeah, I agree. Another area of interest I've had is the ongoing Libyan civil war, and the Quagmires as well.
What a shit show.
So basically, if I can just kind of briefly summarize this, so the United States and some of our allies, we decided that Gaddafi needed to be removed.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So Gaddafi is put away. Obama and basically washed his hands of it and said, okay, the Europeans are going to handle this. We're done. Yep. We don't want to get involved in another Iraq.
Yep.
So the Europeans, they help form a government. If I believe right, the government body is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood party in Libya. I
don't know about that, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But so we have that faction, and then we have the other faction is the I'm blanking on his name. It starts, I believe it's with an H.
General Haftar.
Haftar, exactly. Yeah. Haftar is backed by the Russians, the French, I believe the Saudis.
And the UAE,
yes, and the main government is actually backed by the Europeans, except for France, and Turkey and Qatar. I believe.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
So we've had this ongoing civil war. We lost an ambassador, partly due to the violence.
Yeah.
So
in Benghazi, yeah.
Then that whole investigation with Hillary Clinton and everything.
Right.
Right. So, is there any way to get out of this quagmire in your opinion? because I don't see a side that's. I'm sympathetic to the government that the European Union has backed, but in a sense, I don't trust them either.
No. See, here's the problem. Okay, we all agree that Muammar Gaddafi, who took power, I think in 1969, if memory serves me correct, was a real nasty son of a bitch. He was behind all kinds of terrorist attacks that he sponsored. He was the mad colonel that we, all through the look at the Berlin disco bombing in '86, in which I think several U.S. servicemen were killed. Gaddafi sponsored that. Lockerbie was probably sponsored by the Libyans as well. So there's no question that Gaddafi was a problematic character. I would argue that by 2011, by the Arab Springtime, which I think was the year he died, he was a spent force. He was an old man sitting in his tent. He had his beautiful female bodyguards. Right. Gaddafi was not the Gaddafi of the 1980s. Was he really a problematic person? Probably not. So did we have to take him out? Well, if you wanted to punish him for past crimes, you could have maybe put him on trial. But again, then you have the problems of evidence. The bottom line is that we did take him on, and what have we got in return? As you point out, it's complete chaos in Libya. You have the General National Accord, which is the GNA in Tripoli, which controls that part of Libya. You have Haftar controls the rest of the country. You have Islamic State with a branch in there. Yeah. You have other terrorist groups fighting in Libya as well. Libya has become a hellhole since the death of Gaddafi, and no one's bemoaning the death of Gaddafi. The guy was a incredibly
bad there was Saddam.
Yeah, and yet where are we now? Are Libyans better off? No. Is the North Africa better off? No. And we're back with that, the thing you said before, damn if you do and damn if you don't. Because we didn't have the cojones to stay in there and provide the support that they needed right after Gaddafi fell, we end up with a power vacuum into which these various forces have filled. And now we have a bunch of countries like Turkey recently coming in to support the government against the European Union and against UAE and against Egypt and against Saudi. And it's becoming essentially a proxy war. There are Russian mercenaries fighting in Libya as well as in other parts. There's now Russian mercenaries in Mozambique, for God's sakes, that are trying to kill or trying to hunt down Islamist extremists in that country. So the bottom line, as I've said many times, is that you got to be careful what you wish for. If you don't have a plan going forward, what will be like the day after this happens?
Right.
Taking him out is great. What about the day after, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that? And it seems we don't do that very well.
No,
we do day one really well, but then we drop the ball.
I think a lot of this has to do with so this might be kind of controversial, but in a sense, democracies are very limited in the scope of how they can address foreign affairs for long term, because we actually elect our officials. We change our officials. So mindsets change.
Yeah.
Russia and China don't have to deal with that. They can continue out their foreign policy as long as they want. And as in my country at least, we've seen a tend more towards isolationism and populism. So it's, in a sense, I'm very worried in a sense where we're going with this, because Syria's still a mess, Libya's still a mess.
Yeah.
China's growing its influence, and it's not just soft power, it's hard power as well.
Yeah.
Russia is continuing to intervene around the world. They took Georgia years ago.
Yep.
They're still fighting in Ukraine.
Yep.
That's never in the news anymore.
Yeah, nobody cares.
Yeah, no one cares. I'm very worried for the liberal world order we built after World War II.
I am too. Winston Churchill famously said, "Democracy is the worst form of governance except for all the others." It's not perfect. Right. It has its problems, but it's the best thing we've come up with so far, warts and all. Because if you ask anybody, would you rather live in a democracy or in a theocracy or a dictatorship or whatever the hell you want to call what Putin is running in Russia right now?
Right.
I think they'd pick democracy, even with all the problems that it has. But the problem is, how do you establish a democracy in a place that has no tradition of it, that has no past? It's not impossible. It can be done, but it takes time, and it takes money, and it takes dedication, and it takes resources, and it takes commitment. Going back to what we said earlier, you can't just go and take someone out, leave a bunch of leaflets saying, "Here's how you form a democracy. Here's how you form a parliament. Here's how you vote. Here's how you hold your election, your officials elected responsible." And to answer for what they do. That doesn't work that way. Our own two countries took, again, we came from a democratic tradition, but being, both from Britain. So we had sort of the tools there at the beginning, but it's been a bit of a process. We both have had times where our democracies haven't performed up to snuff, but we had advantages because we came from a democratic tradition. Afghanistan has no democratic tradition. Libya has no democratic tradition. So it's not that it can't take root there. It's just, I think it's a lot harder to do so. And we don't seem to have the patience or the commitment to stay there for the long run. We just want to get out because it's costing us a lot of money.
Another problem is the brain drain that these countries have faced.
Yeah.
Either the intellectuals have left or they've been murdered. So you've had decades of intellectuals murdered or had to flee for their lives. So,
well, let me give you a good example. Your country and my country have benefited incredibly from very smart people who've chosen to live in our countries because they're stable, they're relatively not violent, they're democracies. So we just sold a piano to somebody that we sold it on. Do you have Kijiji? I don't know if it's called. We have Kijiji here. It's a sell something website here in Canada.
Oh, okay, yeah, we have familiar things, but I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, and we put an ad up, and someone responded, and they came to look at the piano, and it turned out I learned that he was actually he's from Iraq. He's a doctor, and he used to live in Baghdad, and he essentially fled the Saddam Hussein regime, and now he's a doctor here in Canada. We're benefiting from that, and that's great, but. Right. Couldn't Iraq benefit from his skills as well? But he was forced to leave. Probably, maybe it was a family safety issue. Maybe that his family was being threatened by the Hussein regime. Maybe he didn't feel safe anymore. So you talk about that brain drain, and that happens all the time. We've got such brilliant people in both of our countries that are helping our economies and helping our societies. That in a perfect world would be able to help their own native societies, the places where they're born, but they simply can't stay there for a whole host of reasons. So. How does that help democracy to form when the very people you need to create it are not there anymore because they feel that they can no longer live in that environment?
Yeah, I kind of call I take the label of a pragmatic idealist in a sense. I have a hard time accepting the, I guess you would call it realpolitik foreign affairs outlook on the world. It's very cold and calculating.
Yeah.
The Kissinger type, essentially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I envision a world in which America and our Western allies and allies around the world, I mean, including in Asia, because we need our Asian allies even more now in these days.
Yep.
To hold back the rise of tyranny in a sense.
Exactly.
And I know that sounds grandiose and maybe a little idealistic, but it's needed.
well, what's the alternative?
Right.
Do we sit back and let this happen? I mean, we can't morally do that.
Right.
I don't think our conscience would allow us to do that. I think that we fought for things and we believe in something and we believe, again, that our system is not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than most of the other systems that we have to encourage. I would say that we need to do that because if we don't, we create more problems for ourselves down the road. Again, going back to the Second World War analogy, because of what we did in the aftermath of the First World War and protections in the 1930s, we paved the way for the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany. We're not responsible for the rise of Hitler. The Germans did that all on their own. Mm-hmm. But we created the conditions that allowed him to achieve power because we sat back. And because we were not, non-interventionists, right? Look at Charles Lindbergh, the great hero of the transatlantic flight, advocating, well, we want to get involved in Europe again. We look what happened in the First World War,
right?
Well, all the soldiers died, but because we chose not to intervene, we got World War II. So I'm not an alarmist. I'm not saying we're going to have World War III. That's not what I'm talking about here,
right?
But I think that we have a responsibility internationally, morally, to intervene where we can, with our partners and in ways that make sense, in ways that are going to achieve the best possible outcome. Even if we don't get all of our goals, we'll get some of them because, as I said, the alternative is much worse. And I don't think we want to go down that pathway. It's easier to sit back and watch. It's easier not to look at, what do, foreign military interventions by the United States cost you guys? They cost you trillions. They cost you trillions, right? But what would they cost if you did nothing for a while, and then at the end of the day, you were forced to sort of go in at the last minute? Well, they might cost you trillions again.
Yeah.
So,
well, I basically touched on every point that I wanted. I had a great time having this discussion. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your time coming on. This is the first time I've got to interview someone outside of my like Twitch and Twitter YouTube sphere. We have a small group of like-minded people that would consider themselves like maybe liberal hawks, some of them neocons, but generally we agree that America and our allies need to still be
Absolutely.
engaged within the world.
Yeah.
So that's mostly what I'm trying to do with my YouTube and my Twitch is continue to have these discussions that I don't feel like are having enough within my generation at all. So.
Well, I commend you for that, and I'll end on this. As a Canadian, you Americans really make me angry sometimes, but I can't imagine having a better neighbor. We could do a lot worse than you guys, all the frustrations and everything. And I really am hopeful. And I said this on another podcast. I think I said it with when I was on with Stephen Bedell and Destiny. We guys really need you back. We need you back in a big way internationally. We fought together on the beaches of Normandy in 1944 for the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. We died on the same battles. And I'm not advocating that we go to war again, but we need all of us, all men on deck, all people on deck to do this kind of thing. We can't have isolationism. It hasn't worked historically. It's not working now and it won't work in the future. So I'm just hoping that saner heads prevail and that we can actually get back to the way we were before, and that the United States can again go back to that leadership function that it always has had. Maybe listen a little more to some of the other allies at the same time, but I think that these alliances they're good alliances. We've been partners for a very, very long time, and it's been a good alliance, and it's done a lot of good. And I hope we can get back there someday. For the record, I'm kind of like you. I'm kind of a centrist on the political spectrum, slightly left of center, but more centrist than anything else. And I just think, again, that we have to, as a community, whether it's your community or my community, we have to listen to each other, have debates, have arguments, agree to disagree, but let's keep talking, because what's happening now in the streets of your cities and my cities and the streets of Western Europe, that ain't right. And that's not going to lead to anything good as far as I can see. So let's just get back to dialogue. And as you know, I've quoted Winston Churchill a lot today. I'm not a Churchillian, but he famously said, "Jaw is better than war." And I'll end with that. It's better to talk than to start killing each other.
Agreed. Well, with that, I thank you again for coming on. If any of you would like to follow Phil, I have all his links in the description on YouTube. Please follow and share his work. Check out his books as well, and his podcast and YouTube. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Okay, take care.